Thank you very much indeed, Geordie. I can now see why I've been invited, and you will indeed be singing before the end of my session, I can promise you. At the height of the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s, the BBC stockpiled a series of films that they would show if the worst happened, the 5-minute warning sounded, and we were all down in the bunkers. And at the top of their pile of films, what they would show us if the Holocaust, the nuclear Holocaust actually started, was a film that would give us this seemingly inconsequential message to the terrified inhabitants of Britain. High on a hill stood a lonely goatherd, lay-o-lay, hey-ho, lusty and clear from the goatherd's throat-herd, lay-o-lay-o-lo. Now, why on earth, you might ask, did they decide that if we really were facing nuclear annihilation, we would want to sing The Lonely Goatherd? Well, of course, the film it comes from, The Sound of Music, arguably the most iconic musical of all times, still beating all sorts of box office records, still showed almost every Christmas day on some domestic television channel and on every bank holiday, is not just about nuns and Nazis, not just about brown paper packages dressed up in string, but it is essentially a moral, spiritual story. It's a story about the triumph of good over evil. It's a story about finding your vocation in life. There is that wonderful piece of dialogue between the Mother Superior and Maria before she sings the song that should be our chairman's theme tune, Climb Every Mountain. It's all about finding what God means you to do. And for Maria, that means being in love with Captain Von Trapp, which is just as much as important as being a nun. And indeed, that song, The Lonely Goatherd, from which you've heard a brief clip, and you can sing along if you want to later, actually has extraordinary spiritual resonance. I teach, among other things, pastoral care and pastoral theology here, and there is a whole pastoral theology in the concept of the lonely goatherd. Many of us who are involved in pastoral work and parish ministry, I think, are actually lonely goatherds, even if we don't all yodel. The works of Rodgers and Hammerstein underline, I think, very strongly the spiritual power of musical theatre. I've just supervised a doctoral student who I'm delighted to say got her doctorate, had her viva last Wednesday, and she was working on the theme of spiritual yearning in the musicals of Rodgers and Hammerstein, and particularly on the influence on Hammerstein of his liberal Protestant background. Everyone thinks Hammerstein was a Jew. His father was a lapsed Jew. His mother was actually a Scottish Presbyterian who came over from Scotland to America and became a Unitarian. And Hammerstein was reared in American Unitarian Universalism. And that's where he got, I think, and my doctoral student does as well, his idealism from. This is where he was fired with the themes that he put into his musicals, the theme of universal brotherhood, the theme of racial equality. Very interesting that Hammerstein was one of the first people to join the anti-Nazi League in the United States in the 1930s. Hammerstein wanted to preach these great significant messages and themes through writing plays. And he only started writing musicals in the early part of his life because he thought he could make money that way, and he would then go on to be another serious playwright. But in fact, he realized that his musicals were actually getting across his message much more powerfully and to a much bigger audience than he would have done if he'd become a serious playwright. And so he stayed with musicals, writing about the theme of community and universal brotherhood in Oklahoma, writing about racial equality in South Pacific and in other shows, and in the Flower Drum Song. And there was a wonderful partnership between him and Rodgers. Cole Porter observed, "I can always tell a Rodgers tune. There's a certain holiness about it." And Stephen Citron, writing a biography of Rodgers and Hammerstein, said that he leaves their audiences glowing with feeling and message, as well as giving them a good time. Rodgers and Hammerstein really establish a paradigm for musical theatre, which is carried on for the rest of the 20th century, full of moral message, full of optimism, full of dreams. In my book about the message of musicals, I call it "You've Got to Have a Dream," which is, of course, a quote from South Pacific. But if you look at most of the great blockbuster musicals, they are about dreaming. They are about human dreams and dreams of a better world, or dreams of being in a better place or a better person. When the center of gravity in musicals shifted from Broadway to London, which it did round about 1970 with Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber's Jesus Christ Superstar, you get a very different set of messages coming into musicals. More angst, more dreams not coming true, much more gritty, much more realistic, much less of the optimism that had fueled Broadway, and yet still huge spiritual influence. In his biography of Andrew Lloyd Webber, called Cats on a Chandelier, Michael Coveney describes the theme, and I would entirely agree with him, that runs through all Lloyd Webber's music as being that of spiritual yearning. Wishing you were somehow here again, wishing you were always near. Now there's a song which you'll all know from Phantom, sung by Christine as she stands at the grave of her father. And that's a song with huge spiritual power. Again, I use it when I'm teaching pastoral care. I've used it in bereavement counseling, because that song wonderfully takes you through the stages of classic grief, what we all feel when we've lost someone close to us. And it also takes us to the point we all need to reach when we've lost someone, which is that very difficult but that very necessary letting go. And it's a wonderful evocation of grieving, the grieving process. Talking of bereavement leads me to one of the ways in which musicals are very clearly demonstrating their spiritual power. Figures recently released by the Cooperative Wholesale Funeral Society, which are the biggest providers of funerals in this country, show that pop songs and songs from shows are now outnumbering hymns in British funerals by 2 to 1. And it's certainly borne out by my own experience. I take a lot of funerals predominantly at Holy Trinity Church here, where I'm the associate minister, and I probably take 20 or more a year. And I've recently taken funerals which have involved the music of Freddie Mercury and Queen. My Heart Will Go On from Titanic, which is consistently in the top 10 songs requested at British funerals, tracks from Phantom and other ones. And these are songs that are speaking to people in their moments of deepest grief and yearning. There's also a lot of God talk in musicals, and not least in Les Miserables, which the film version of which, of course, has rightly made such an impact in earlier this year. Les Mis is actually an interesting example of something which has got more and more spiritual in its different incarnations. Some of you will know the original novel by Victor Hugo, which is not particularly spiritual. It reflects Hugo's own free-thinking deism. The first French concept version by Alain Boublil and Claude Michel Schoenberg, which was the start of the musical, is almost aggressively secular if you listen to it. The English language libretto, written by Herbert Kretzmer and put on, of course, by Trevor Nunn originally at the Barbican, is much more obviously religious. It reads like a religious text, references to the never-ending road to Calvary, the blood of the martyrs, huge numbers of songs conceived as prayers, God on high, hear my prayer, and so on. And in the film, it's even more specifically religious and specifically Christian. I find it fascinating. The imagery of the cross comes up again and again in the film. And of course, the songs from Les Mis have been used as anthems for all sorts of causes, empty chairs and empty tables for the victims of HIV/AIDS. Les Mis is about the power of redemptive love, the power of sacrifice. It's also about how different people conceive God. Jean Valjean, of course, who undergoes a kind of conversion to forgiveness, seeing God in terms of forgiveness. Javert, seeing God in terms of judgment. Thénardier, seeing God as dead in a song which is sadly cut out of the film, Dog Eats Dog. Fantine, of course, who dreamt early on that God would be forgiving, but the tigers of the night come and shatter her dreams. There's a huge amount of spirituality in musicals, particularly in Les Mis, and we're going to finish off by singing together, as lustily as you can, the final chorus from Les Mis, which is pretty well straight from the Bible and could easily be sung in church, just to give you some sense of the spiritual power of musicals.
Do you hear the people sing, lost in the valley of the night? It is the music of a people who are climbing to the light. For the wretched of the earth, there is a flame that never dies. Even the darkest night will end and the sun will rise. They will live again in freedom in the garden of the Lord. We will walk behind the plowshare. We will put away the sword. The chain will be broken and all men will have their reward. Will you join in our crusade? Who will be strong and stand with me somewhere beyond the barricade? Is there a world you long to see? Do you hear the people sing? Say, do you hear the distant drums? It is the future that we bring when tomorrow comes.